Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Blair Van Dyke, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our two presenters in this session. Bryan Birch is the Director of Religious Studies Program and the Center for the Study of Ethics at Utah Valley University. His research interests include interreligious studies, comparative Mormon theology, and the ethical dimensions of religious diversity. He currently serves on the Board of Trustees and Executive Committee of the Parliament of the World's Religions, and is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Religious Diplomacy. His latest work includes the completion of a volume entitled Mormonism Among Christian Theologies with Oxford University Press. Bryan is the only Board of Trustees member of the Parliament of the World's Religions west of the Mississippi, and he was very, very influential in planning the Parliament that was recently in Salt Lake City last fall. And so his involvement in the establishment of borders as it relates to the Academy, Mormonism, and diversity within the world's religions is very significant. Dennis Potter is associate professor of philosophy at Utah Valley University, where he specializes on the philosophy of religion and the history of analytic philosophy. He has published widely in Mormon theology and related issues, including liberation theology and the Book of Mormon, finitism and the problem of evil, What Does God Write in His Franklin Planner, the paradoxes of providence, prophecy, and petitionary prayer, and religious disagreement, internal and external, for the International Journal of Philosophy of Religion. He is currently working on the philosophical dimensions of religious heterodoxy, which will be part of his presentation today. Would you please join me in welcoming Bryan and Dennis?
These conferences are always the highlight of my spring. As many of you witness every year, Boyd and Dennis and Blair and I and other colleagues have great fun here. I have the best job on campus as far as I'm concerned, and enjoy all these associations and to be among friends. The title of my remarks are taken from Robert Frost's iconic poem, Mending Wall. There are many poignant aspects of that poem, but one that strikes me particularly is the phrase, "Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense." The idea of a good fence is of particular interest to me. A fence is a way of demarcating boundaries. Creating and sustaining boundaries, as we know, is part of the human condition. In order for something to have an identity, there needs to be something that separates one thing from another. There are boundary conditions across all aspects of human life, and these allow us to navigate the diverse world of objects, peoples, and cultures. This diversity hit home for me upon my arrival in New York City on June 5th, 1983, when I reported for LDS missionary service. After 3 short weeks of rehearsing imagined interfaith encounters, I was thrown into the streets at the epicenter of religious diversity. From the moment of my arrival, we were interacting with both the exotic and the urbane. Hindus, Muslims, evangelical Christians, Sikhs, Baha'i, Satanists, Pentecostals, Jews, Wiccans, Unitarians, Nazarenes, and of course the most exotic of religious creatures, Presbyterians. I ate it all up. We were visiting synagogues, Jehovah's Witness Bible study, Pentecostal prayer service, Nation of Islam meetings, Eckankar, and among my favorites was Mass. Though I remained a dutiful missionary, and my connection and affection for my own tradition developed in profound and unexpected ways, I found my interactions there to be fascinating, profound, and yet, in many respects, they were unsettling. On the one hand, I discovered a deep and abiding admiration for the lives of people whose experiences are so rich and diverse that they defy even our best explanatory capabilities. I was experiencing what Krister Stendahl called holy envy. One of the favorite statements of mine out of the mouth of Joseph Smith is that, quote, "We should gather all the good and true principles in the world and treasure them up, or we shall come out true Mormons." The statement is said in the context of his discussion of friendship and charity, with a rather passing reference to other Christian religions. The passage preceding the quote above is a rhetorical question, where Smith asks, quote, "Have the Presbyterians any truth? Yes. Have the Baptists, Methodists, etc. any truth? Yes. They all have a little truth mixed with error." I present these remarks this afternoon in the spirit of trying to treasure up all that is good and true. And one important way to do this is to honor the diverse principles, and one important way to honor these diverse principles is to try to make sense of them. But how does one go about identifying truth from error in other religions and cultures? The facile response is to say that truth is whatever is propositionally consistent with the current teachings of the LDS Church. However, this masks a deeper set of issues that I would argue lie just beneath the surface in Latter-day Saint interfaith relations. The question of diversity comes at a particularly crucial time for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is becoming increasingly clear, at least to me, that the Church is entering a new phase in its development, which I call the engagement phase, as compared to previous periods, which one could call isolation, accommodation, retrenchment, and other categories used by sociologists and others. Of course, we can quibble about the appropriateness of this or that categorization, but I hope we can all agree that engagement, integration, and inclusivity are on the rise in the official discourse and activities of the LDS Church. Recent General Conference addresses provide solid evidence that there is a marked effort to address themes of interfaith inclusion and to utilize vocabulary recognizable to wider audiences outside the Church. Other evidence includes evolving conceptions of the Great Apostasy, or the so-called Great Apostasy, in LDS theology. The tone and tenor of official statements coming out of the Public Affairs Department of the LDS Church, and the increased involvement in projects related to interfaith dialogue, as I mentioned above. So if we can agree that this is underway, what are the theological implications of this phase? What options are present within Mormon scripture and discourse? What are the ramifications of exploring what is not in currency, but what is possible? What constraints exist in pursuing these resources? And finally, how does all of this relate to current authoritative discourse in the Church? Like other traditions, there are ebbs and flows in the history of LDS teaching. Certain ideas in the repository of the faith will come to the fore, while others fade into the background. Some are viewed as better left to history, while others are rekindled and given new life relative to the contemporary situation. New questions emerge in light of new experiences, relationships, and interests. In reviewing the LDS literature on the status of other faith traditions, three thinkers have been especially helpful in asking the right kinds of questions, though admittedly, they address these questions from very different angles. The first of these thinkers is Eugene England, whose work is familiar to many of us. Gene was someone who was particularly effective in posing momentous and, we all know, at times uncomfortable questions. A case in point is his 1998 essay on becoming a world religion, in which Gene lays out one of the key questions of this paper. What are we to, this is Gene now, quote, "What are we to make of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving God who by nature is concerned equally about all his children, but whose absolutely crucial message of salvation he can only communicate to a very small fraction of those children? Certainly less than 10% of the estimated 70 billion people who have lived on the earth have even heard of the Christian gospel. Perhaps 2 or 3% have accepted it, and something like 1/100th of 1% have been Latter-day Saints." End quote. In his 1969 classic Faithful History, Richard Bushman engages questions of historiography by saying that we, quote, "cannot content ourselves with the history of the church because statistically speaking, it is such a small part of world history. We must find some way of bringing a larger portion of mankind within our field of vision." End quote. Bushman gestures toward new possibilities for exploration beyond what he calls the national histories contained in the Scriptures. He does so, however, by showing us how the Scriptures themselves might be useful in narrating other histories from an LDS perspective. And again, this is Bushman. "We need new histories that appeal to our views of causation, our sense of significance, and our moral concerns. Since the materials out of which histories are made are so vast and flexible, historians are forever rearranging old facts and assimilating new ones into accounts that will help those in the present, understand the past." End quote. I think these insights can apply with equal force to questions of comparative theology. I happen to believe that we have only begun to mine the possibilities in comparative studies within Mormon intellectual endeavor. In order to accomplish this, however, we need to resist the tendency toward what I would call theological solipsism. We need more scholars asking serious questions about the diversity of religious experiences we encounter. We need to avoid stopping at facile connections when they have served their apologetic ends. In trying to account for the religious experiences of others, we risk, as Richard Bushman put it, stuffing them into our own categories, and thus watering down the commitments of both faith communities. On the other hand, failure to do full justice to the lives of those who die outside the gospel is to risk not being true to our best selves. The third thinker I want to consider is Spencer Palmer, who wrestled with questions of diversity and who recognized many of the implications that arose in trying to come to theological terms with diversity. He acknowledges that, quote, "in the restored church, the relationship of Christ to his prophets is clear, but within the context of world religions, their relationship to Buddha, Muhammad, Mahavira, Zoroaster, Confucius, and Lao Tzu is not so well defined." End of quote. In the same work, Palmer presents 5 common responses in the LDS literature to what he calls the religious resemblances between Mormonism and other world faiths. The first one is what he calls diffusion. The second is a common human predicament. Third is what he calls primordial images. The fourth is divine inspiration. And the fifth is the devil invention theory, the most intriguing of the 5. Palmer draws these categories from Milton Hunter's classic, The Gospel Through the Ages, in which Hunter argued for a hybrid account of religious similarities. And this is Hunter. Both the independent development and diffusion theories can be accepted as answers to the problem of why there are resemblances in world religions. Doubtless there has been an interplay of these two forces operating throughout history. But Hunter makes an interesting claim that has momentous theological implications. He says, if the Lord should so desire, he could reveal the same truths to 2 men who lived in different parts of the world and who were completely inaccessible to each other. On the one hand, this seems obvious to most Mormons. But there is another important strain running through LDS thought, maintaining that the content of revelation is given relative to, quote, the conditions in which people find themselves. One example is found in the Book of Mormon, in Alma chapter 29, which reads, "For behold, the Lord does grant unto all nations of their own tongue to teach his word, yea, in wisdom, all that he seeth fit they should have," end quote. Another puzzling aspect of this is that if God can reveal the same truths to different cultures, why doesn't he? With so much emphasis placed on mortal life in the Mormon plan of happiness, if only a minute fragment of the human family has experienced genuine faith and has been genuinely tested, to use Mormon terminology, one needs to face up to the potential implications. Is God's plan for mortality failing? Are there multiple incarnations in which to accomplish the purposes of mortal life? Or is the plan of mortality more broadly defined than presently articulated? A common response, of course, is to reference the continuation of this process in the spiritual development of human beings beyond the grave, including the millennium. Though this is an essential and powerful part of LDS doctrine, in agreement with England, I maintained that an adequate Mormon theology of religions cannot put all of its stock here. The mortal experience of the billions of people who have lived and died outside the LDS gospel needs to be adequately accounted for in order to count what is happening in mortal life as a successful application of bringing to pass the immortality and eternal life of man. In addressing this challenge, I believe there are resources within LDS thought that could, if so desired, move us toward what I call praxis inclusivism. That's a technical theological term, which I'll explain a little bit here. The famed Catholic theologian Karl Rahner is well known for his supposition of the anonymous Christian, according to which, and this is Rahner, quote, "A man may already possess the sanctifying grace and may therefore be justified and sanctified, a child of God, heir of heaven, and mercifully and positively on his way toward his supernatural and eternal salvation before he has accepted an explicitly Christian confession of faith and has been baptized," end quote. So the question at hand is just how much inclusivism can Latter-day Saint theology allow for? Rahner's account is a substantially more robust version of the inclusivism than the one described in the LDS textbook Religions of the World, a Latter-day Saint view, which for many years served as a standard text for BYU religion students. It describes the position of inclusivism as follows. It describes inclusivism as the position asserting that one religion is correct and true, but that other religions do have genuine value, end quote. This rather weak version glosses a key question. What is the extent of the value in other religions? Can a devout Buddhist monk be closer to exaltation than a faithful Latter-day Saint? What does it mean to be closer? If we can answer affirmatively, what are the theological and practical implications of this? One key question involves the extent to which spiritual progress is tied to propositional belief and ritual performance. Though the saints affirm, along with many other Christians, that every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus is the Christ, this is certainly not a sufficient condition for exaltation in the kingdom. If another necessary condition is spiritual progress, then we need to explore what counts as spiritual progress and in the ways it cuts across denominational lines. Augustine stated, and he's famous for this, of course, that many whom God has, the church does not have, and many whom the church has, God does not have, end quote. If this is true for Mormons, like it was for Augustine, what virtues are exemplified by those outside the church who God is said to have? I maintain there are ample resources within Mormon scripture and teaching that lend support to a more robust form of praxis inclusivism. By this term, I mean, and this is Birchian language, the affirmation of equally efficacious forms of spiritual life across religious traditions. And by efficacious, I mean that which positively leads human beings toward exaltation, which of course is the ultimate objective of human life. I said above that there is evidence that the criteria for spiritual success is expanding. Consider the recent statement by the LDS Church entitled Respect for a Diversity of Faiths that includes relatively strong inclusivist language. In addition to restating the virtues of kindness and respect, the document affirms Krister Stendal's rules for religious understanding. which include his dictum, as I mentioned above, that we should leave room for holy envy by finding elements in other faiths to emulate. It also quotes with approval Orson F. Whitney's statement that, quote, God is using more than one people for the accomplishment of his great and marvelous work. The Latter-day Saints cannot do it all. It is too vast, too arduous for any one people, end quote. Another intriguing document in this regard is the authority of the church section of the church's newsroom webpage, and it states as follows. Although Latter-day Saints believe that divine authority was lost in the ancient church after the death of the apostles and required a restoration by divine intervention, they do not dismiss or diminish the validity of other people's religious experiences. Though none of these statements directly affirms praxis inclusivism, at least as I have defined it, they certainly point us in the direction, and they raise questions regarding these implications. Precisely what elements should be emulated in other faiths? What form should this emulation take? How much should we openly discuss what we envy in other faiths? What does validity mean when it comes to diverse religious experiences? And with that, good afternoon. Thank you.
Okay, my presentation today is part of a paper that's a longer paper. I've cut out significant portions of it, and so I hope it still coheres. It's forthcoming in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. Is it the next issue, Boyd? Well, he's not listening. Okay. Let's see if we can get through this in time. I'm going to start off with a quotation from Joseph Smith's History of the Church. Some of you will be familiar with this. Sometime in the second year after our removal to Manchester, there was in the place where we lived an unusual excitement on the subject of religion. It commenced with the Methodists, but soon became general among all the sects that in that region of country. Indeed, the whole district of country seemed affected by it, and great multitudes united themselves to the different religious parties, which created no small stir and division amongst the people, some crying, "Lo here," and others, "Lo there." Some were contending for the Methodist faith, some for the Presbyterian faith, and some for the Baptist. What is to be done? Who of all these parties are right, or are they all wrong together? If any one of them be right, which is it, and how shall I know it? Clearly, Smith was concerned with which of the above-mentioned denominations is correct, if any. This is the concrete problem that he faced. This concrete problem is also an instance of a more general epistemological and, I think, semantic problem concerning the nature and status of religious belief. To see this, first note that Smith mentions only Christian denominations and doesn't mention Islam, Hinduism, etc. Given the time and location, Smith would have known about these other religions, but none of them would have been a live option for him, to use William James's famous phrase. It seems apparent that he had already decided that Christianity was correct, and his problem was to figure out which denomination had the correct interpretation of Christianity. So Smith's concrete problem is not best understood as the problem of interreligious diversity, which is what Bryan was addressing. Instead, Smith's concrete problem is better understood as an instance of what I call the problem of intra-religious diversity, or heterodoxy. Whereas the problem of interreligious diversity deals with how one should respond to the fact that there exists disagreement between religious traditions, the problem of heterodoxy deals with how one should respond to the fact that there exist different interpretations of the same religious tradition. That is, the problem of heterodoxy asks not which religion is true, but which interpretation of X is the correct interpretation where X is replaced with whatever the religious tradition is. Christianity, Buddhism, Mormonism. I submit that this is Joseph Smith's question, not the question of interreligious diversity. The problem of heterodoxy is an underappreciated problem in the epistemology of religion. Usually, when philosophers deal with epistemological issues relating to religious disagreement, they focus on disagreement between religious traditions and not within traditions. And this is a serious lacuna in the philosophical literature, since the problem of heterodoxy is actually more fundamental. Moreover, since Smith put this problem at the center of his explanation for the need for a restoration of Christianity, it's important to explore to what extent Smith offered a plausible response to the problem. In this paper, I will offer a reconstruction of LDS Mormonism's theology as a response to the problem of heterodoxy, and in the end, I will argue that the response fails to solve the problem and provides a basis for the ecclesiastical authoritarianism that's manifested in the current Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So a couple of distinctions. This is part of the paper I'm cutting out. So I'm going to use external versus internal disagreement to talk about disagreements between traditions and then disagreements internal to a tradition. That distinction's obvious. I also think that there are different types of disagreements internal to a religious tradition. One type is about the doctrines. So for example, Catholics and Protestants disagree about the Immaculate Conception. It's a doctrine that Catholics accept, Protestants just reject it. However, there are other types of disagreements that I'm more interested in. Interpretive disagreements, ones where people in the same tradition say the same thing but don't mean the same thing. So the Trinity is a good example of this. I think Latin Trinitarians who think that God is three persons and one substance are different than social Trinitarians who think that God is three persons and one economic entity. Mormons obviously could accept the second, but couldn't accept the first. So external and internal religious disagreements pose different philosophical problems. External disagreements raise an epistemological question. Which belief is true, if any, and how do we know? Internal disagreements, interpretive disagreements in particular, raise a semantic question. What are the beliefs of the faith? Now, the second question is a semantic question because it requires that we determine the meaning of the expressions of the language. In other words, external disagreements threaten the epistemic status of one's belief, whereas internal disagreements threaten the very identity or content of the belief. And this is why it's relevant to this question of boundaries. This is the first reason that the problem of heterodoxy is actually more fundamental than the problem of interreligious disagreement. Moreover, the problem of heterodoxy is logically prior to the traditional problem of religious disagreement. Indeed, every external religious disagreement depends on how the respective faiths are interpreted. As I mentioned, whether or not Mormons can agree with the doctrine of the Trinity depends on whether you agree with the Latin Trinitarian version of it or the social Trinitarian version of it. So there's no fact of the matter as to what Mormons actually say about the doctrine of the Trinity. Smith's solution. The LDS understanding of the apostasy, no wonder I can't see this. The LDS understanding of the apostasy and the restoration, as based on the account of the first vision in Joseph Smith's History of the Church, is presented as an answer to the problem of heterodoxy. That is, Smith, on the current LDS understanding, was not concerned with which major religious tradition was correct. He already knew that Christianity was correct. He was concerned instead with which interpretation of Christianity was the correct interpretation and with which Christian organization actually represented God's will. Of course, the first source to go in trying to determine which version of Christianity is correct is the Bible. And Smith did look to the Bible for an answer to his question. I think I'm actually going to skip some of this. Well, no, actually, okay. So he looked in James 1:5. He found this passage that says, the teachers, or no, sorry, you can look up James 1:5 yourself. Sorry, he says with respect to that passage, he says this: the teachers of religion of the different sects understood the same passages of Scripture so differently as to destroy all confidence in settling the question by an appeal to the Bible. Despite that, he actually, though, still appeals to James 5, which, of course, tells him to, if he has anything that he doesn't understand, that he feels like he's ignorant about, he can just ask God, and God will give him an answer. So this is how I think Joseph Smith understood that passage, is that he could actually ask God, God could answer his question, and in that way he would solve this problem. He would be able to figure out which denomination was the correct one. And so you could see the first vision as not only a response to the question that Smith had, but it's also actually, in a way, an example of the answer to his question, namely by getting personal revelation. Or in other words, it constitutes an instance of the type of event that is central to the answer, to Smith's answer. To be sure, the answer to the question about which church is true at this time that Smith is writing is none. But the answer to the more general problem of heterodoxy is that we need revelation, and the first vision itself is an instance of the kind of revelation that we're talking about. Latter-day Saints believe that the traditional Christian churches had all deviated from the truth, and as a result, God was no longer in contact with humanity. They call this the Great Apostasy, or more simply, the apostasy. Smith initiated a new dispensation in which God would be in communication with humanity through his prophets. And this answers the problem of heterodoxy because God can settle disputes about how to interpret Christianity by speaking to his prophets. In other words, the only way to preserve orthodoxy would be to reinitialize contact between God and humankind. That is the restoration. And have that contact continue into the future. That is continuing revelation. Let us be clear about what is implied by this approach to the problem of heterodoxy. Recall that the problem of heterodoxy is the problem of how to determine which interpretation of a particular faith tradition is correct, given competing interpretations. In particular, members of the same faith might accept the same doxastic expressions, or belief expressions, and yet interpret those expressions in a different way. One major factor that leads to the problem of heterodoxy is that the religious leader in question is dead. And so if a question about what he or she meant, or they meant by a certain doxastic expression arises, we cannot ask him, her, or them. The first aspect of Smith's solution to the problem is simple. Jesus is not really dead, and so in effect we can ask him, and we can use this method to settle all disputes about the content of faith. Clearly, this is a subjective approach to solving the problem rather than an intersubjective approach. The intersubjective approach would be to look at the scriptures and see which, given the evidence in the scriptural text and given the historical evidence, which religious tradition gets it right. And of course, that's not going to give you an answer. It's going to be underdetermined. The Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, the Catholics, the Greek Orthodox, they're all going to make good cases for their interpretations. So, now, intersubjective evidence, that kind of evidence, the kind that academics deal with, is evidence for everybody if it's evidence for anybody. A mathematical proof is a proof for you as well as for me once we both understand it. So that kind of evidence is good to work with because, I can understand what you're saying. Subjective evidence, by contrast, is non-transferable, to use Peter Van Inwagen's term. If I have subjective evidence, there's no procedure that I could follow that would be sufficient for making that very same evidence available to you. An example of subjective evidence is memory. I recall that the bird that I saw yesterday on my hike was a finch. Since I didn't take a photo and I'm basing my claim on memory, I can't show you my evidence. If you believe me, it's because you trust me. The LDS concept of revelation is essentially the same as the concept of religious experience discussed in much of recent philosophy of religion. As such, revelation, of course, is subjective evidence. This is obviously true of most religious experiences, including what Latter-day Saints call the witness of the Holy Ghost. Of course, someone might claim that Joseph Smith's first vision was a publicly available experience of the Father and the Son. That is, if anyone else had been present in the sacred grove on that day, such a person would have seen and heard exactly what Smith saw and heard. But granting that an eavesdropper would have seen personages floating above Smith and radiating light, it's not clear that such an eavesdropper would have seen the Father and the Son. Indeed, perhaps such an eavesdropper would have seen two demons or two extraterrestrials. That is, even if a religious experience is simultaneously an ordinary perceptual experience, the religious content goes beyond the publicly available content. Given that Smith's solution to the problem of heterodoxy invokes subjective content and evidence, it avoids the underdetermination problem that's faced by the intersubjective approach. Despite there being more than one interpretation of the faith that fits with the intersubjective evidence, it might seem that there could be only one that fits with one's subjective evidence. Since Smith's solution to the problem of heterodoxy involves reference to subjective experiences that cannot be transferred to others, I will refer to this view as interpretive Gnosticism. To repeat, interpretive Gnosticism is the view that one can settle the question as to which interpretation of religious tradition is correct by subjective religious experiences. I'm going to cut out a section here where I compare this approach to what's called Reformed epistemology, which is the most prominent kind of epistemology in philosophy of religion today. And it's definitely of a Protestant flavor. The name is obvious in that case, Reformed epistemology. And of course, what I'm going to talk about here is restored epistemology. Okay, there are problems with this. Despite being initially plausible, there are problems with Smith's approach to the problem of heterodoxy. The first problem arises from the fact that the content of religious experience is subjective. To be sure, there are such things as subjective justifications for beliefs. Memory is one of them. We've got to rely on that. But Smith's use of religious experience as an answer to the problem of heterodoxy is not just an attempt to justify a particular belief over competing beliefs. This is important. It is an attempt to determine what the belief even says in the first place. This move from the epistemological to the semantic totally changes the game. Indeed, given that Smith's solution employs a subjective religious experience to determine the proper content of a belief expression, then it seems clear that Smith's solution involves an appeal to subjective content to determine the correct meaning for certain expressions in language. In other words, Smith's solution assumes that there is a private language. Now, in this next section, I explain why there cannot be a private language, and I'm going to quickly talk through that point, but it's going to be very quick because I don't have time. My version of the private language argument that I'm talking about here is Otto Neurath's. But the idea here is that a subjective state of your mind, some kind of content in your mind, cannot determine the meaning of a linguistic item or linguistic expression. Why? Well, it seems like maybe it could, right? But the problem is that subjective content passes. And when it passes, when it's gone, then you don't know, you have no more access to your own past subjective content than you have access to the subjective content of somebody else. And so you actually can't determine the meaning of the expression over time based on that subjective content. Most philosophers of language accept that you can't have a private language, and so this would be a very problematic position to hold if it indeed follows from Smith's approach. Okay, I'm going to go on to another criticism. Oh, actually, let me finish up with that one a little bit. As soon as the religious experience that's intended to fix the content of the faith has passed, then the question of how to interpret that experience arises again. Suppose, for example, that Smith receives a revelation that F is the right interpretation of the belief expression E. By supposition, he knows what he means by the words in F at the time because he has a private mental state. But as soon as that mental state is gone, the question of how to interpret those words again arises. And as soon as he's dead, it's even a bigger issue. Given Smith's approach, this problem can only be solved by having another religious experience. And so it would seem that this approach, interpretive Gnosticism, leads to the conclusion that one must be in a constant state of receiving revelation from God so as to fix the content of one's beliefs. So this objection to the interpretive Gnosticism leads to another doctrine in Mormonism, namely the necessity of having continuing revelation. At any moment when a question arises about how to interpret a doxastic expression, one must appeal to religious experience. Thus, we see that it is reasonable that the doctrine of continuing revelation accompanies this doctrine of the restoration. Another problem with Smith's approach arises from its subjectivism. The problem is that someone besides Smith might have an experience that confers a belief that disagrees with Smith's conclusions about the proper interpretation of the doxastic in question. If a 14-year-old boy with very little education and no training in theology can settle theological questions by asking God, then anyone should be able to do so. But of course, this opens a Pandora's box. One person, we could just all get competing interpretations this way. I mean, this is actually a really good way to argue with Mormons. If they say, well, the Spirit told me, just say the Spirit told you the opposite, right? Because it did. At least it always did with me. Notice this leads us right back to the problem of heterodoxy. So it seems that interpretive Gnosticism really doesn't solve the problem at all. LDS doctrine has an answer to this problem as well. The answer is to privilege the religious experiences of some over others. This leads to a hierarchy, where those at the top have the power to interpret the faith for everyone else. And this would explain why LDS Mormonism's focus on the central role of priesthood authority in the restoration. It would explain why they focus on that. If you grant all the assumptions that are made in Smith's solution to the problem of heterodoxy, then it might seem to work at this point. We might call the LDS approach restored epistemology, which amounts to reformed epistemology, so it's similar to the Reformed tradition, plus what I would call epistemic authoritarianism, namely the view that religious experiences of some trump the religious experiences of others. But I think that this fails. One of the assumptions here is that the religious experiences of some trump the religious experiences of others. This assumption of epistemic authoritarianism is itself problematic, I think. The problem is that there cannot be any good reason for accepting the claim that the religious experiences of some trump the religious experiences of others. To see this, let's consider the following scenario. This is the most important thing in the paper. Josephine lives in a town with 3 Mormon churches: the LDS Church, the Community of Christ, and the Apostolic United Brethren, fundamentalist, polygamous group. Josephine considers herself a Christian, but she wonders which denomination is truly Christian. Moreover, given where she lives, she's learned a little bit about Joseph Smith and has read the Book of Mormon and wonders about Smith's claim to having restored Christianity. But in her investigation of Smith's restoration movement, she has discovered that these Mormon denominations disagree deeply about how to interpret Smith's restoration. She wants to discover what Smith really taught in order to assess his claims to having restored Christianity. So how can she know what Smith really claimed, given the wildly different interpretations of his teachings? Clearly, Josephine's quandary is formulated to be analogous to the situation in which Joseph Smith found himself. If Smith's quandary was similar to Josephine's and Smith's restoration was an answer to this quandary, then Smith's answer should work for Josephine as well. What is she to do? Restored epistemology tells her to go with whatever the authorities say when it comes to matters of internal disagreement. But which authorities should she listen to? LDS? FLDS? I changed that. The AUB or Community of Christ? The LDS approach is that she should attempt to have her own religious experience to figure out which Mormon denomination truly represents Smith's approach. So let's imagine that Josephine does this and concludes that the Community of Christ gets it right. Now, it seems clear that there are plenty of LDS Mormons and AUB Mormons that would claim that her experience conflicts with their authorities, and that hence they can dismiss her experiences as being incorrect. They are also epistemic authoritarians. Actually, the Community of Christ probably isn't, but she can't use her own religious experience to adjudicate the issue of whether she should trust the leadership of one denomination over the others, since those that adhere to the other denominations are in the same situation as she is with respect to the denomination that she chooses. Instead, if she gets it wrong, then she is actually violating the epistemic authoritarianism of Smith's approach. Perhaps she can just privilege her own religious experience over everyone else's. This would, of course, solve the problem of disagreement with the authorities of the other denominations, but this would be to take the Reformed approach. In other words, she would be a Protestant then. Of course, it's obvious that Josephine's quandary cannot be solved by an appeal to the authorities of one of the denominations, since that is the very question at issue. Finally, there doesn't seem to be any intersubjective way of settling the dispute about who is interpreting Smith most faithfully. But without a subjective or intersubjective justification for believing in the epistemic authority of the LDS or the Community of Christ or the FLDS leadership, there's no justification for this assumption. If you are an outsider, to accept one version of Mormonism, you must trust its authorities without any substantial reason to do so. But now, notice that everyone starts off as an outsider. Even if one's born into the LDS Church, one must still be converted. It's part of the theology. Therefore, it follows that even lifelong Latter-day Saints themselves have no real basis for trusting their leaders. Restored epistemology amounts to epistemic bootstrapping, begging the question, and thus it fails. Mormonism's epistemic authoritarianism requires that I trust another's religious experience more than my own. And it requires that I do this without any independent check on this person's testimony. Indeed, there are cases in which it is rational for me to trust another's testimony more than my own. For example, I should trust my doctor's diagnosis of my medical condition more than my own diagnosis, or the scientific community's nearly unanimous verdict on anthropogenic climate change over my own internet research up on it. Sorry. But these are cases where there's an objective way to determine who the experts are, and I am not one of them. In a way, religious authorities count as experts, of course, but there are different groups claiming to be the experts on Mormon doctrine. They each deny the expertise of the other groups, and the only way to determine who the real experts are would be to settle the problem of heterodoxy in the first place, namely to know which denomination gets it right. So unless we have a solution to the problem of religious experts, an objective criterion for determining who they are, we don't have a solution to the problem of heterodoxy. And unless we have a solution to the problem of heterodoxy, we don't have a solution to the problem of experts. The upshot, I believe, is that we are not in a position for it to be rational for us to defer to experts on matters of religious belief. It would be irrational to do so. And so it would be irrational for us to accept the Orthodox LDS solution to the problem of heterodoxy. I'm going to skip a section where I attack Bryan, because I do that often enough. I don't need to do that again. And I'm going to conclude really quickly. We can talk about atheology as a way of maybe answering my problem later if there's time. So here's my conclusion. Many Latter-day Saints discuss Mormon doctrine as if it involves a set of transcendent propositions. They distinguish between what Mormons actually believe from doctrine. They use the word doctrine really loud. Doctrine, right? The tone matters. That is, they use the concept of doctrine in a normative way. This language presupposes a determinate set of propositions that are the true doctrines of Mormonism. They believe that part of the restoration of the gospel is the identification of these doctrines. The problem of heterodoxy leads us to wonder, with Joseph Smith, in fact, whether we can know what that determinate set is. Latter-day Saints believe that Smith's restoration does indeed solve the problem, and that anyone that wonders which Christian denomination is correct can follow Smith's example. But I have argued that Smith's approach is problematic, since it asks us to trust religious authorities without any reason to do so. And I want to end with what I'm going to start calling Potter's slogan, because I've said this so often, because and this is my final conclusion. It's related to the title of this. I think that what divides us most deeply cuts across religious traditions rather than between them. Thank you.
Anyway, so with our presenters, Bryan, let's start with you, and I'll pose the first question and then jump in. Again, keeping your questions concise and actually asking a question, please. Bryan, would you please compare and contrast the 1893 Parliament of the World's Religions and the 2015 Parliament?
One way to answer that question is to say that in the 1893 Parliament, at least B.H. Roberts, if not the church, was anxious to participate and be involved. In the previous Parliament, the 2015 Parliament, the LDS Church was trying to decide how and to what extent it ought to be involved in the Parliament that was now in its home headquarters. And so there's one respect in which you can contrast the two in a very positive narrative to say, look how far we've come, right, in terms of the place of Mormonism among the world religions, where in 1893, 3,000 invitations went out, and the Latter-day Saints were not among them, to 2015, where the worldwide headquarters of the LDS Church is hosting the Parliament. So that's one narrative. The other narrative is the one I gave previously. And it really speaks to what I observe the LDS Church is trying to negotiate and navigate in developing partnerships with different organizations in the interest of interfaith engagement. And that is, what organizations, what personalities, what do they represent publicly, how broad a spectrum does the church want to engage, and what are the implications of those associations with perceptions of the church in the broader world. I think those are all very live issues right now, and I think the Parliament was a case study in the church trying to figure out how it relates itself to an organization that, at least since the 1993 Parliament, has had more of a progressive orientation. And so it's much easier now for the church to do interfaith relations when it's more closely tied to commonalities on social issues and very practical work. There's more tentativeness, I observed, when it comes to ecumenism. And that's a distinction that the church has made very clear, trying to distinguish between cooperative endeavors across traditions versus involvement in ecumenical relations that might water down the distinctive claims of the church. So it was a fascinating experience for me to be involved in organizing the Parliament and trying to encourage more participation by the Latter-day Saints and advocating and trying to get as much involvement as I could. And we were, of course, very pleased that the church opened the tabernacle for the Sacred Music Night. Some of you may have attended that. It was a wonderful gathering. It was the most diverse group of human beings ever in the city of Salt Lake and in the Tabernacle in particular. And so I think that speaks to the progress I believe is being made. But it also leads to just interesting questions about how this worldwide church is going to move into what I called earlier the engagement phase.
I'm sorry. I said basically they snubbed the parliament. They could have said an apostle or the first presidency. Uchtdorf would have been a marvelous speaker, and they sent Forum of the 70 instead.
I would not use the word snubbed. There were difficult negotiations early about exactly how the parliament would be organized. So the parliament was announced to come to Salt Lake City before all of the T's were crossed and the I's were dotted in terms of what level of support they were going to get from the LDS Church and other community organizations. And so it's not just what I mentioned before, the issue of how the church is connecting to different organizations. It had to do with very practical realities about how parliaments are organized, what costs and burdens would be placed upon the community and the local governments, and what might be placed upon the church if they committed more strongly. So there were a whole array of issues that went into that. I can't speak to the particularities of Elder Clayton's participation as opposed to another one of the leaders of the church. That's what the first presidency decided. Yes. That's what the first presidency decided when the formal proposal went from the parliament to the church to have a speaker at the plenary session.
Can I add to what Bryan said? So I attended the parliament also and spoke at it, and the distinction I perceive is that the 1893 parliament was very kind of Christian was the main narrative, and then Eastern or non-Christian religions were the marginalized. And in a way, the modern parliaments have kind of reversed in that the modern parliament, this one and probably others, are more global and non-Christian in orientation, and then the Christian religions were actually, in my perception, very underrepresented, especially the Protestant religions. Am I correct on that? Almost, I saw very few. And so with that change in orientation, then Mormonism's relationship to that kind of global emphasis, which tended to be more environmental, social justice, poverty, these kinds of things, rather than emphasizing things like kind of Christian morality that you would have seen in earlier parliaments. And so I don't know how obviously the church's engagement with kind of basically hippie religions would have gone over for the church. I don't know if I'm not saying that critiquing, because I love hippie religions. I'm saying how the church would have perceived their engagement in something that really didn't have a broad Christian representation. So,
well, two lessons emerged from the parliament experience from the standpoint of the organization. I mean the parliament, not the LDS Church. And that was that it's important to understand the host community better, because it was clear to them that they did not understand the LDS community as well as they would have liked to when they first initiated the process. The second lesson that was pretty much unanimous among the board was that the parliament needed to reconnect with established religious organizations and the leadership of these organizations. And so that'll be an effort between now and the next parliament to work toward developing some of these relationships that have been lost since earlier parliaments, so that the parliament is not perceived as a hippie progressive religion, or organization, excuse me.
as awesome as that was, though.
Okay, so question for Andrea and then a question for Dennis.
Question for Andrea and then a question for Dennis. Andrea, do we have any idea how Emily felt about being scripted by B.H. Roberts. Was it B.H. Roberts? And then can you say a little bit more about that wonderful private tension you excavated between polygamous and non-polygamous Mormon women, and is that directly due to being just after the manifesto? And then should I wait, or should I save my question for Dennis right now?
Maybe wait. I'll
okay.
answer them quickly.
Okay.
We don't know much about Emily's own internal tensions because she didn't leave a diary.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
So we
yeah.
don't even know all of these monogamous women that I'm studying in late 19th century Mormonism. They aren't writing why they did. So there's that. The tensions between the polygamous and the non-polygamous suffragists, particularly, you don't see it publicly because they're all very Mormon about it and love, love, kiss, kiss, hug, hug. But behind the scenes, this caused some hurt feelings. Emmeline B. Wells, in particular, felt like she was kind of shunted out because all of a sudden we have to trot out the monogamous women to represent the Suffrage Association. But at the same time, Sarah Granger Kimball had been marginalized earlier because she had famously rejected Joseph Smith's proposal of marriage and had remained monogamous. And Janelle Higbee argues that led her to be marginalized in Salt Lake City Relief Society leadership. She never did achieve that kind of Relief Society prestige that all of her sisters were doing. Mm-hmm. Until then, the Suffrage Association says, we need monogamous women to come be your suffrage leaders. And then all of a sudden, Sarah Granger Kimball is trotted back out again. And then you see her placed in photos with Susan B. Anthony, et cetera, whereas she'd been kind of marginalized for a couple of decades. So there were tensions behind the scenes. Later on at statehood, the women kind of shifted into their political party alignments, and that caused hurt feelings as well. Emily Richards was a Democrat, Emmeline B. Wells was a Republican. Those caused hurt feelings that were kind of under the surface. So
those are incredibly important tensions, and I'm really hoping you'll write more
I hope so, too.
about that. My question for Dennis, of course, I love your term interpretive Gnosticism. I think it works. I think Mormonism is very Gnostic. I think Joseph Smith is very Gnostic. But I want to ask you, in terms of the private language, which is also a really intriguing and important concept, 2 points that you made, that after a personal revelation, we can't re-access that again. So it doesn't really, it's not a language because it can't endure. And then also, it's not really private. And I would question both of those premises. And I want you to respond to this. Isn't it possible that we can re-access a revelatory bit of information, especially if you see it as bringing something unconscious into the conscious? Once it's conscious, you can remember it, you can re-access it. And then also this notion of private language, is it not really private? Isn't there in Mormon theology a kind of concept that we're all kind of participating spiritually in that private language? It's the language of God, and so it can sort of be re-accessed.
Yeah, I cut out the section on private language. I mean, this is I didn't want to talk a lot about it because it's a technical area and there's a lot about this. To really make the case against private language, I'd have to say a lot more than I can say here. I don't think there's any way you can recoup the concept of private language, and most philosophers of language are with me on this. But that's not an argument, right? But I would say, yeah, actually, no, I don't think you're right. I don't think you can access something again. I think you can remember what you did before, but memory is fallible. And you would have to check the memory just like you would have to check somebody else telling you. You have to check. I mean, you could write it down in a little book. Well, this is what I seem to recall, but there you have to interpret what you wrote down. You can't, I mean, one subjective experience isn't going to give you access to a different subjective experience. It's just going to give you access to that subjective experience. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't see how you're going to solve this problem. I mean, Joseph Smith is dead. We don't know whether the AUB I actually think probably, I mean, I'm just based on what I know, but I mean, I think I could make a case that the AUB and the FLDS Church are actually way more close to what Joseph Smith was doing than the LDS Church, right? And that Joseph Smith, if he were around, would be a member of one of those churches because he seems a lot more like their leadership than he does like the leadership of the LDS Church. Somebody could probably make that case. And I don't see how anybody who's LDS could argue against that, right? But of course, the case could be made the other way as well, and that Joseph Smith never meant to be so extremely fundamentalist and doctrinaire and literalistic in how everything needs to be interpreted, and that there was supposed to be flexibility and so on. But of course, once you start going that route, then the community of Christ is a possibility too. And so,
I just don't have, I have no idea what it would be to be Mormon. And so I can't convert to Mormonism because I don't know what it is. I would have to know before converting what Mormonism is in order to convert, and I can't know what it is, so I can't convert.
It's lots of food.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a round of applause for our presenters.